have 3 speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. First, Jacob Darwin Hamblin, who's an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. He is currently writing about past efforts to use environmental crises to promote nuclear technology around the world. His books include Arming Mother Nature, The Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism with Oxford in 2013, Poison in the Well, Radioactive Waste in the Oceans at the Dawn of the Nuclear Age with Rutgers University Press from 2008, and Oceanographers and the Cold War from 2005 with Washington University Press. Cyrus Moody, who's an assistant professor in Rice's History Department, a fellow with the Center for Contemporary History and Policy at the Chemical Heritage Foundation, and an external collaborator with the Center for Nanotechnology in Society at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His work draws on the history of recent science and technology, especially US physical and engineering sciences, to think through social and policy issues such as the commercialization of academic research and government support of renewable energy industries. And Rebecca Slayton, who's a lecturer in public policy and junior faculty fellow at the Center for Environmental Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Is that right?
International security.
International security. What did I say?
You said environmental security.
Sorry, that's the environmental word. Her research examines the relationship between and among risk, expertise, and political culture. She recently completed a book, Arguments That Count, Physics, Computing, and Missile Defense, 1949-2012, with MIT Press, that was last year, 2013, which explores how experts formulate distinctive conceptions of risk, how their judgments become influential in the policy arena, and how these processes change over time. Her current research is examining the social, institutional, and technological history of the smart electrical grid. So with that, then we can welcome Jacob.
Thank you very much. I think the microphone is on. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here, happy to be first. I was joking earlier that I'll try to keep the bar as low as possible so that you will all feel great when you give your talks. I say that only half jokingly because what I'm doing is introducing an idea for my next project that's based in part on some recently published work that I'll describe in a moment, a particular case study having to do with Iran. But I would welcome comments now or later, formally or informally, about the scope of my project. About a year ago, I published a book called Arming Mother Nature, which was to my mind, about bringing 2 narratives together. One was a narrative that is a science and the Cold War kind of narrative, and the other one is an environmental narrative. And it was really about how this collaboration between scientists and the military on trying to understand the environment to fight against the Soviet Union really informed a lot of ways that we think about catastrophic environmental change. And I think maybe in the course of researching and writing that book, I started thinking about these narratives. And so what I'll talk about today is a little bit of narrative dissonance, where we have stories about the past and understandings about the past that really conflict with one another in some pretty fundamental ways. And that's how we're going to get to talking about nuclear energy and also about oil. I'm also going to talk somewhat about nuclear weapons. It doesn't seem like it's an energy thing, but as I think you'll see, they're very much related. The current project is on the environmental crisis and the nuclear order. And what I'm exploring in this project is the use of environmental crisis, or what today we would call environmental crisis, as a way of promoting nuclear technology or technological solutions. Whether it's climate, I mean, today you're probably very familiar with the argument that, well, because of fossil fuels and climate, we must have nuclear technology. This argument has been used in lots of different other contexts for the last several decades, whether it's about pesticides, whether it's about potable water access, whether it's about population or food issues, mutation, plant breeding, fertilizers, you name it. These have all been nuclear-related solutions that are tied to some sort of crisis, and that's what I'm exploring in the book. It's not the full scope of what I'll talk about today, but I just want to give you an idea of that. What I am going to talk about is this idea of narrative dissonance, and there are lots of different ways that you can look at the history of nuclear energy. And one way that we're not typically looking at it, I think, is in the context of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. And I'm giving you these two images. What I mean in terms of narrative dissonance here is that you could look at the history of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons very much as a narrative about energy rights and the rights to nuclear energy. And that is definitely the way it is perceived by a lot of the signatory states. This is a treaty, by the way, if you don't know much about it, that was negotiated in the late 1960s, and it's often touted as one of the most successful international treaties because you've got 180 plus members of it, people who've decided to swear off nuclear weapons. Now that's as far as that's as far as the definition goes from the point of if you're looking at this primarily as an arms control treaty. But how it's perceived by most countries who signed on to it is it's an energy rights treaty. So, for example, in the news when we hear, we see things like this from Iran saying nuclear energy is our right. What is negotiated in the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear? Can I say NPT? Okay, thanks. What was negotiated during the NPT discussions was we will decide we will swear we won't build nuclear weapons in return for guaranteed access to nuclear technology in the peaceful domain. This was sold to them, promoted to these countries as something that is very promising for them, and they could have access to this very promising energy technology in the future. And then we have conflicts about nuclear issues. In countries like Iran, they're usually promoted in this way. This is one kind of narrative. This is an energy rights narrative. It's not what we get necessarily in the United States, because typically in the United States, for a lot of reasons, we look at this as an arms control issue. We think about why does Iran have a nuclear program? Why does Israel have a nuclear program? Why does Pakistan have a nuclear? Why do all these countries have nuclear programs? What are they trying to do? How are we able to control what technologies and material they have access to? It's a very different kind of narrative. It's about controlling the spread of a technology, and that narrative. And I'm going to try to persuade you of this today. That narrative has not always been the case, even from the American context. That's going to change in the 1970s, and we're really living with the legacy of a changed narrative. So from the point of view of Americans and, let's say, Europeans looking at countries like Iran, the question has been about controlling access to a technology rather than trying to spread a technology and providing rights to its technology. So, from the reason I have Lithuania's ambassador over here is because this has come up in a major way quite recently. This is from several weeks ago at the UN Security Council when Lithuania said, Ukraine signed the NPT after the Cold War, guaranteeing it access to nuclear technology and handing over its nuclear weapons in return. It gave them back to Russia. The NPT, in that context, was meant to be, in this sort of nuclear energy is our right, we're able to do this, oh, and by the way, you're supposed to guarantee our territorial sovereignty. That obviously did not happen. But from the point of view of the West and the Soviet Union, or Russia at that time, it was very much, okay, let's control the access to the weapons themselves. I'm really just laying out this kind of narrative dissonance. On the one hand, nuclear energy as a right, and the other one as weapons proliferation. It's an interesting issue because the NPT, from the point of view of the West, it seems obviously it's dangerous to have more countries have nuclear weapons. But in reality, what the NPT has done is to provide a justification for armed intervention. This is why, for example, the Iraq War happened. That you had this non-proliferation treaty saying we will not build nuclear weapons. Let's send IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors in to make sure they don't have them. And there was a war because of this. And I'm not trying to say that it was a justifiable war, but it was used as a justification for armed intervention. So one could argue that the NPT, which started out as this energy rights treaty, has been used more as a justification for armed conflict. And I'm going to continue with some cases of armed conflict as my remarks go forward. So, one way to look at this is as a humanities dilemma. As many of us in here are the humanities. Again, I'm trying to frame this as a humanities dilemma because it is really about the kinds of stories we tell and the perspectives that we have. Whose narrative do we choose? Do we choose the kind of post-1970s American or Western European narrative, or do we choose one that comes from all the other countries that signed on to this? And one way of looking at that is the kinds of things you care about. For me, in the story that I'm trying to tell and the story that I'm researching, I'm focusing on communities of expertise. Because I think that these are the hidden aspects of the spread of the nuclear world. What we tend to focus in on are material and technology. We wonder about, well, does someone have uranium enrichment technology? Does someone have the ability to make plutonium? What kinds of, do they have centrifuges? What do they have? What's okay in a nuclear energy reactor versus a nuclear weapons program? The technology, right? On the other hand, that's one thing that we seem to really care about. And we talk a lot about, and we try to control. The other thing is the material itself. And I'm sort of joking here, right? You have uranium oxide, yellow cake, as you see in the news, and below it's a yellow cake. Just a little humor there for you. On the top is the one we actually care about. The bottom is just yellow. The top is something that we care about because we don't want yellow cake to get from wherever it's being mined and processed, and you don't want it to get to some country that you don't want to have a nuclear weapon, right? You're focusing in on the technology, you're focusing in on the material, whether it's enriched uranium, whether it's plutonium. What we don't often focus on are the scientific communities and the reasons those scientific communities were promoted for a long time. And what I'd like you to come away with from my remarks is that the United States and many others had lots of reasons for promoting scientific communities in the nuclear realm for a long time in a lot of countries, and are responsible, and this is where we have to really question ourselves about how we have participated in this. And the United States has been responsible for the creation, often from nothing, of communities of nuclear expertise in lots of different countries around the world, including Iran. So, scientific communities is something that we just don't often talk about. And the irony, from one of the many ironies of that, is that those communities, they're definitely needed no matter what you're going to do, whether it's nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, anything, and all those other dimensions I mentioned before, creating a desalination plant for clean water, all these other things. You need those communities to be there. They're often sought, and they're also often targeted. So, for example, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a number of Iraqi scientists were targeted for assassination because they were thought of as possibly contributing to the nuclear weapons program. Whether they did or not, we can leave that question aside, but they are targeted people. They're members of a community that often is created not necessarily as part of a weapons program. Okay. I'm just going to give you some examples of things that just completely fall under our radar in terms of promoting. Number one, the International Atomic Energy Agency is a promotional agency. It's a hammer in search of a nail. It has if you've got a problem, they've got a solution. The solution is a nuclear one. They don't have another, unlike the other UN specialized agencies devoted to food and agriculture, devoted to UNESCO is the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, devoted to health, World Health Organization. The IAEA really just has the one solution. So they are, in many respects, are a hammer in search of a nail. They promote nuclear solutions all over the world. Not just the IAEA, the Central Treaty Organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States and allies for years used nuclear technology as a way to bring people together. The first nuclear institute, for example, under CENTO was created under the auspices of the Baghdad Pact. Was supposed to be located in Iraq, but then Iraq left the Baghdad Pact, and so it was located in Tehran, which was the center of nuclear cooperation for a long time, supported by the United States and Europeans for political purposes. And I'm not going to go into all the different cases, but just to give an example of countries that were drawn into this as a way of promoting their own nuclear communities that didn't necessarily exist before. And when I say promotion, what are they doing? They're going to the United States or going to European countries, going to their laboratories, studying, learning, going back to their home countries, and building up the infrastructure of any kind of nuclear community, whether it's for nuclear-powered electricity or whether it's for potentially a bomb program later. Turkey is one, Pakistan is one. This is an American who is Edward Durrell Stone. Some of you are interested in history of art. He was an architect who designed the Kennedy Center, and he also designed a lot of the early buildings of Islamabad, the new capital of Pakistan. And these are just gratuitous Iraq. This is a gratuitous Iraq slide I'll give to you. I want to move on to the Iran story, just to give you the basics of it. so that I make sure that I come in on time. This is an example of the United States pursuing nuclear solutions in a country that, for lots of weird reasons that are very unexpected to us today. This is an ad from the 1970s. Guess who's building nuclear power plants? This is the Shah of Iran. This was an interesting question. Why is a country like Iran that has so much oil building nuclear power plants in the 1970s? And the argument went that, well, they see it as economical. They think this is going to be part of their energy security in the future. And they have been persuaded of this for lots of logical reasons. Therefore, and this ad says that therefore we should also be building them in the United States. But why would you do this? Why would, if you're sitting on all this oil, why would you build all these nuclear power plants? Well, the truth is, we now know from declassified documents, this is something that I published on recently in the Journal of Diplomatic History, that this was a very explicit reaction to the oil crisis of the early 1970s. And it wasn't the Shah of Iran's reaction. It was the United States' reaction in concert with other oil-consuming countries, Western Europeans and also Japan. It's like, look, we've got a problem, and it's because some countries are not selling us oil anymore. And Iran is selling us oil. They didn't actually do an embargo. But what we want to do is make sure that this can never happen again. We don't want there to be an oil crisis like there was in the early 1970s. And the way that we do that is we choose some countries. Specifically, let's choose Iran. We choose a country that has a lot of oil, and we need to find some way of making sure they can never stop selling us oil. And the way that we do that, and I say we, this was something that Henry Kissinger thought up and persuaded the Nixon number one and then Ford number two to try to implement. We need to convince Iran to make major capital commitments to the West. And what that means is we need to sell them a heck of a lot of stuff. And let's make sure there are big ticket items like nuclear power plants. And we will go there and persuade them that their future is nuclear. They need to make sure they build all these plants. You build a community of expertise. And they met with European allies and said, you need to sell them as much as you can too. The French persuaded the Shah to build a uranium enrichment plant in France. The British persuaded them to pay for all kinds of safety contracts in the UK, bringing British experts to Iran to advise them on seismology. You know, there's all kinds of things that you need to do for building a nuclear infrastructure. The Germans also promised to build nuclear power plants. All of this was by design as a way to make sure that the Shah had bills to pay so that he would never be able to reduce the amount of oil that Iran produced, because he would have to sell that oil. Nuclear power was only one part of the package. And that's one part of this that is kind of overlooked. This was part of a huge series of packages in the mid-1970s that included not only nuclear power, but lots and lots of military hardware. This is a period in which the United States and Europeans as well promised, particularly Iran, promised to sell Iran everything it wanted short of nuclear weapons. So if you want to have, these are F-14s by the way, lots of F-14s, fighter jets were purchased during this period. The French were selling the Mirage fighter planes. I found these great documents saying, you know, they are signing on to these things and they don't realize what we're doing. Because from the Shah's point of view, this is all great because the Americans are willing to sell all this military hardware, which later is going to be used in the war against Iraq. I mean, they weren't planning that at the time. And of course, today, it's part of Iran's military hardware. I mean, I could go on and give the details of this. I'm really just giving you the broad brushstrokes here. That this is having bills to pay, being persuaded that they were going to be able to get energy from nuclear power. What's crucial about this is that Iran needed to have access to enriched uranium for these nuclear power plants to work. And what that meant was some sort of basis of trust. And the basis of trust was the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which guaranteed access to enriched uranium. So they spent a lot of money on American universities. They spent a lot of money in France on an enriched uranium facility. And after the Iranian Revolution happened, what happened? The French said, you know what, we're just going to hold on to this. The Iranians never got any of the enriched uranium from this whole period. The promise from their point of view, if you think about access, you think about rights to have energy, regardless of what you think about the Iranian nuclear weapons program, they have a leg to stand on. They never got the energy they were promised. And they spent a heck of a lot of money trying to get it. Eventually, in the 80s, the French just said, well, here, just take a check. You can have the money back. Part of this conversation is about energy security and the ability of Iran to have something that's self-contained so they don't have to rely on the Americans to make good, or the French to make good, or anyone else to make good on their promises. But from our point of view, the narrative is quite different. Why must they have enrichment facilities within their own country? They must be building a bomb. These two narratives are in conflict with each other. And I don't know which one is right. And that's the dilemma that we have. How do we tell this story in a way that is instructive and doesn't just reinforce our own national perspective? Because our own national perspective will look at this in a very clear-cut way that, wow, we need to contain this nuclear weapons program. But from the point of view of the Iranians, it's quite different. They never got any fuel. And I suppose I'll just leave it not with anything really strong to say, but with these concluding questions. Number one, how do our narratives reinforce our own national politics, and how can we possibly reframe them? And last, how do our own energy solutions, especially the ones that rely on technological solutions, how do those become tools of manipulation? Thank you.